Welcome to Nature Matters, the WWF-India podcast which focuses on all things wildlife, nature, people, and the planet. I'm sure you've often wondered how animals move outside protected areas. Where do they go? How do they get there? I have with us Dr. Prachi Thatte. She works with WWF India and she leads all the wildlife corridor work. So we're going to ask her a bunch of questions about how animals, tigers, elephants, and other animals are moving in this great country of ours. Hi, Prachi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
My first question to you, which a lot of people ask, and it's really probably a complex concept. What is a wildlife corridor?
So, wildlife corridor is the area that animals use to move between two habitat patches. Now, habitat patches for tigers in India are largely areas like tiger reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, or even other large forested patches which may not have formal protection but host populations of tigers, including and are big enough to have breeding populations of tigers and enough prey to sustain them. Tigers are wide-ranging species like elephants and other large mammals. So, protected areas or wildlife sanctuaries may not always be enough for them. They often venture out of their habitat patches for food in search of water or mates. And while doing this, they move through areas that are wildlife corridors. In fact, male tiger cubs, like cubs of other cat species, move away from their mother's territory to establish their own territory. So sometimes they move hundreds of kilometers away from their mother's territory looking for another suitable habitat. And the paths they use, the areas they move through are wildlife corridors. The older, still popular definition of wildlife corridors is a strip of habitat connecting two different patches.
Yeah.
While there are corridors like that in India, and they're very important, those are not the only type of corridors. Very often, corridors are a patchwork of agriculture and forests, and animals move through these areas. And which is not really surprising, because if you think of any tiger reserve or wildlife sanctuary, take Corbett or Ranthambore or even Kanha, they are surrounded by agriculture, villages, roads, and railway lines. So it's these tiger habitats are embedded in a sea of human-modified landscapes. So when they step out, they often have to navigate through agriculture, patchy forests in order to reach the other area. So these are wildlife corridors which could be connected forests between two patches or a patchy mosaic of forests and agriculture.
Right. So, we have heard these amazing stories of tigers in Bhopal, tigers coming to Lucknow, tigers coming to Bharatpur from other parts of India. And it's amazing because it seems like the tigers are making their own maps of India. I have to ask you, what is your favorite memory from a corridor?
Well, there are a lot of interesting memories from corridors because I've worked in these corridors for a few years now. But the one that comes to mind is from a corridor in central India. Mm-hmm. It's from a tiger corridor, although the incident doesn't really involve tigers. So we were working in a corridor that connects Kanha Tiger Reserve in Madhya Pradesh with Achanakma Tiger Reserve in Chhattisgarh. Mm-hmm. This is one of those patchy corridors with forests and agriculture, more forests in this case than agriculture. Mm-hmm. And we were doing surveys to understand how tigers and other wildlife use this corridor for moving between the two areas. So we were doing surveys every day. One day after day's work, in the evening, we were returning to the forest rest house where we were staying. And we were in our vehicle on the way back, and on the other side of the road, we spotted a couple of jackals. So we stopped our car and we wanted to observe what they were doing because they were coming towards the road. So this pair of jackals came towards the road, moved a little back again from the road, waited in a bush next to the road, looked around on both sides of the road. A couple of bikes passed, one car passed, and then there was a gap in the traffic. And that's when they crossed and trotted away on the other side. Nothing dramatic about this incident, but it has still stayed with me. It was fascinating to watch them make that decision of crossing the road. Yeah. Also because that's exactly what we were trying to study. How do these species navigate through human-modified landscapes? Through agricultural fields, how do they cross roads, etc.? And it's not always possible to observe animals, right? These were jackals which are more common, say than tigers or leopards or other species. So it's not always possible to observe them and make notes and try to understand. So a lot of times what we do is we use sort of indirect methods of studying that, and that's what we were doing in that corridor. I was collecting poop samples to extract DNA and then understand how do species move. That was a part of my PhD. At WWF, what we do to study corridors is we place camera traps in these corridors, in both agriculture areas and forested areas, to see which are the areas that animals are using and how much. Another type of survey that we do to study corridors here is also looking at animal signs. So the teams walk in the forest, look for wildlife signs, including pug marks, poop, etc. Make note of that, and then look at the whole corridor to see which are the areas that are being used, which are not being used, and so on.
So then, a corridor is something that connects, say, two habitats or two areas where animals live together. But then, could a corridor also be habitat in itself? Does it have value as, a habitat for some other species or something like that?
Yeah, that's very common, and very often that's the case. And this incident that I told you about the jackals actually live inside tiger corridors. So the tiger corridors are huge. They're big landscapes, sometimes up to thousands of kilometers. And while tigers use them for movement, tigers can move hundreds of kilometers at a time. Many smaller species, including the jungle cat, jackals, pangolins, use them as habitat. They are smaller species, they require smaller areas, and they live within the corridor. These species are called corridor dwellers. And this is sort of one type of use of corridors as habitat. Larger species like the tigers themselves can also use these areas as both habitat and for movement. So, for example, there's a corridor in Terai between the Dudhwa National Park and Kishanpur Wildlife Sanctuary. The All India Tiger Estimation is done every 4 years. So, during this tiger estimation, camera trapping was carried out in both Dudhwa Tiger Reserve and Kishanpur Wildlife Sanctuary. And they saw that a tiger that was captured in 1 year in Dudhwa was the next time captured in Kishanpur. So, that gives an evidence of the corridor in between being used by wildlife. So this corridor is an agriculture-dominated corridor. 80% of the area is sugarcane fields, and tigers are still using it to move between these two patches. And recent studies by WWF team there also gave us data to show that it is not only used for movement, not like a quick movement through sugarcane to reach the other patch. The female that they followed and got data for spent months within the sugarcane fields. She would go to the boundary of the two parks on either side and then turn around and return. So this tiger was clearly using it as a habitat and not just for moving between patches. So very often corridors can be used as both habitats and for dispersal between habitats.
It's amazing to me that a corridor, a good wildlife corridor, shelters something like the Indian pangolin, which is extremely threatened because of poaching. And it's also amazing that tigers are using corridors not just to move, but also as habitat. And therefore, my question, Prachi, is if we are to go about saving corridors, which is probably one of the only ways that tiger populations can go up, what would you say could be a good prescription for saving our corridors?
Right. So the strategies for saving corridors depends on what are the challenges within that corridor, what threats the corridor is facing. Because different corridors have different characteristics and the threats are often different. So I'll just give a couple of examples. One is of a corridor between Kaziranga National Park and Karbi Anglong Hills. So
in Assam.
So if you think of the Kaziranga landscape, the Brahmaputra flows towards the north. South bank of the Brahmaputra is the Kaziranga National Park. Southern boundary of the Kaziranga National Park is where NH 715 goes. So it connects two towns in Assam. And south of that are the Karbi Anglong Hills. So the Brahmaputra floods every year. So every time the Brahmaputra floods, the Kaziranga grasslands also get inundated. And animals move from Kaziranga to the Karbi Anglong Hills. And while moving, they have to cross the NH 715. This is a highway that connects Tezpur with Jorhat and a little beyond. So it's one of the major national highways and has high traffic. So a lot of times the seasonal migration also leads to animals getting killed on the roads. It happens even otherwise when it's not this flooding season. And this has been increasing over time is what the Wildlife Institute of India report says. So this road that passes through the corridor that connects Karbi Anglong Hills and Kaziranga is a threat to the corridor. Solution to that is often having mitigation structures. For example, elevating this road so that vehicles pass over the flyover and animals move freely below it is one way. And actually, the flyover or elevated road for the Kaziranga Karbi Anglong corridor has been approved for a few years now. Once it gets made, it will be the longest mitigation measure in a corridor in India. Okay. So that's one of the ways in which you can secure corridors. Another example is of a challenge, because barriers like roads are not the only threats within corridors. Some of the challenges of managing corridors is also working on wildlife conflict. So when tigers move through these corridors, they often prey on livestock that is there in the villages, which leads to human-tiger conflict.
Yeah.
And managing this conflict is very important for effective conservation of that corridor, so that in the long term, the movement still continues and the well-being of people is not affected. So that's very important to take an approach to save a corridor based on what are the characteristics and the challenges in it.
Right. So if I were to ask then, Prachi, that what would be the single corridor in India, if you work on that particular corridor, it's really going to impact tigers positively. If I asked you to pick one, or maybe two, if not one.
Yeah. One may not be possible. I don't know if I'm also going to be able to pick two, but I can just sort of talk about an approach that we can take to prioritize which corridors to work on.
Yeah.
And there are different ways of looking at this. Let's take an example of a corridor in central India. The Kanha-Pench corridor that connects Kanha and Pench tiger reserves in Madhya Pradesh is one of the most important corridors in central India, arguably. It is a corridor that supports tiger movement. It's a very well-studied corridor. There are otters and rusty spotted cats in the corridor.
Yeah.
And it also is home to breeding tiger populations in pockets. So it's a corridor which is both habitat and facilitates movement. Now, saving this corridor is very important because both Kanha and Pench are very high-density tiger populations in central India. They are important for the whole landscape and the surrounding protected area. So if we lose this link, we're going to lose the most important link in central India in a way. So this definitely is an important corridor and a way to prioritize. But on the other side of the spectrum is a corridor in the same landscape between Satpura Tiger Reserve and Radhapani. This is one of the shortest corridors in central India, very close to each other.
So how long is it?
It's maybe around 20 kilometers or so. I'm not sure about the exact length, but a lot of corridors in central India are 100 to 150 kilometers away, straight line distance. So this is one of the shortest corridors in the central Indian landscape. However, it is also a corridor which has very little forest cover. There's a lot of agriculture. The Narmada River flows through this corridor. So the agriculture has been there for the last 100 years at least. And that is evident from the Imperial Gazetteer of India, which the Britishers wrote. And there are records of agriculture in areas around that corridor. That corridor also has two big towns, Hoshangabad, which is now Narmadapura, and Itarsi, which is a major railway junction, and these have been expanding over years. So there's agriculture, there is expanding towns, and the recent genetic data suggests that the functional connectivity in this corridor is almost negligible. So despite being a short corridor, it is under threat. And there's a tributary of Narmada that flows from Satpura towards Radhapani, and that is likely the only remaining link. So if we want to conserve this corridor, that's where the focus likely should be. And losing this corridor would also mean losing the whole link, right? So whether we put resources in saving corridors which may get lost in the near future or maintaining the corridors that are good and we know are important can be a trade-off. And these are the considerations go in prioritization exercises in order to decide where. We may not be in a position right now to sort of we may not need to pick one or two corridors. In the given scenario, there's a lot of focus on tigers and the increasing tiger numbers. And one of the ways to sustain this increase in tiger population is also maintaining corridors. So the forest department, NGOs working in different landscapes are also focusing on corridors. So together we may be able to focus on more than a few corridors.
Yeah. So you mentioned camera trap studies in the corridors. Could you just spend a couple of minutes telling us about how these corridors are really being identified or monitored by WWF and the other NGOs that WWF is working with?
Right. So corridor identification needs, there are different ways in which corridors are identified. Often, several NGOs, including WWF, does camera trapping in these corridors, which identify large spaces between two tiger reserves. These are then systematically surveyed. There are camera traps placed in sort of systematic manner across the corridor. And usually placing of camera traps is identification of areas where animals move, trails that animals may move to, water bodies they may go to.
Yeah.
Such areas are identified and cameras are placed on either side of the trail, for example. And when an animal passes, the movement is detected and the cameras take a picture.
Yeah.
So that's how surveys are done across corridors. Another way to identify corridors is using radio telemetry. And WWF and other organizations often radio collar tigers and other animals to see how they are moving. And this is a direct way of looking at corridors, where you can see animals moving through different types of landscapes and reaching the other patch, but such movements are not always common. So even if you radio collar a tiger, it may not always go to the other patch. It may just move around its home range, or sometimes the collar stops working. So this is a way of identifying corridors, but not always feasible to use. Another way is, of course, also using genetic data, because if animals move between two patches and breed, you get that signature of genetic mixing between the populations, and you can use that to identify corridors.
Yeah.
So WWF currently uses a lot of camera trapping, some telemetry, and also science surveys that I mentioned earlier to identify corridors and monitor them.
So I must ask you to tell me an example of a good corridor, a corridor that maybe sustains other kinds of taxa or other kind of species as well, not just tigers, but maybe some other species. So what is a good corridor in India that you can tell us about?
A good corridor that supports tigers and other species. I can think of two corridors immediately. One is the Dudhwa-Kishanpur corridor, which is an agriculture-dominated corridor in the Terai in Uttar Pradesh. It supports not only tigers, but it has swamp deer, it has hog deer, it has fishing cat, and it also has swamp francolin, which is endemic to the Terai landscape. Another corridor is the Kana Pench corridor, which has otters, which has rusty spotted cat, does, sloth bear, leopards, and tigers. Apart from these, any corridor I think that facilitates movement of these species is also a good corridor. These two corridors also support other species.
Thank you so much. I mean, as you can tell, it's not easy being a wild animal, and it's definitely not easy being a wild animal if you're outside a protected area. There's a lot for an animal to negotiate: railway lines, highways, mines, large industries, projects, etc. And saving corridors, saving the habitat, which allows animals to move freely and without getting hurt or injured, is going to be the future of conservation. Thank you so much for listening to Nature Matters, the WWF India podcast on nature, wildlife, people, and the planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you.